All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Ben Hong, and I'm a Senior Developer Experience Engineer at Netlify and a Vue.js core team member. And today, I have the great honor to introduce the participants for the Going Beyond Static Sites panel discussion. First up, we have Sarah Drasner, who's an award-winning speaker, VP of Developer Experience at Netlify, Vue core team member, and staff writer at CSS Tricks. We
Yeah,
also have
hi.
Gift Egwenu, who is hello.
Hi.
Sorry. Next up, we have Gift Egwenu, who is a front-end engineer and technical writer at Passionate People and runs the Vue Vixens chapter in Nigeria and the Jamstack community in Lagos.
Hello.
Next up, we have Phil Hawksworth, who is a principal developer experience engineer at Netlify with a passion for browser technologies and empowering the properties of the web.
Hello.
And finally, moderating this panel is none other than the host of the Jam Dev Conference, Brian Rinaldi. Take it away.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks so much. So I'm really excited about this panel. I've got three of my favorite people in the Jamstack community, Sarah, Phil, and Gift. I'm really grateful to you all for being here. I'm really excited to chat with you all. Okay, so we already went through introduction, so I won't spend any more time on that. I am curious, though. Tell us a little bit more about how you got started in the Jamstack. What tools did you learn with, and what made you interested in starting with the Jamstack, to pursuing the Jamstack further? So we'll start with, we'll start with Gift this time.
Awesome. All right. I have like an interesting story of how I stumbled upon the Jamstack. So in early 2018, I would say I decided to build a personal portfolio for myself, and I found Jekyll helpful for me to use then. And I was very excited, even though I never knew what I was using or what I was doing then was called the Jamstack, right? So I explored building a personal portfolio for myself with Jekyll, and I deployed it to GitHub Pages. And with further research, I found Hugo as well. And I also started looking into Hugo, and I got an opportunity to be an open source contributor for an Hugo-based team. So I was part of a small team building a custom team for Hugo. That was a very nice experience. All this while still, I never knew there was something called the Jamstack. Finally, when I first heard about the term, I think I was just going through Google and I came across, actually, if I remember correctly, I found that term through Twitter, and I decided to do my own research. And then I discovered that what I've been doing over this period is termed the Jamstack. So I started doing more exploration. Then I was trying to do more content creation, because obviously the reason why I created the blog was to blog more. So I wrote a blog post about the Jamstack, what the Jamstack is and why people should try it. And following that, I got into the community, not also knowing that there are like a lot of other tools and services that I could leverage to build blazing fast application, right? So I continued doing my experimentation, I would say. And then I was a Vue developer, right? So when I heard about Noxt, I was super excited because that was another way for me to merge two of my passions. So I started working with Noxt as well. And yeah, I think I have done a lot with Jamstack over the last 3 years. And that's how I started out. Yeah.
No kidding. That is like you've for just 3 years you've managed to cross like the whole spectrum of tools here. It's amazing. So Sarah, I'm gonna pose the same question to you.
Yeah, I think 3 or 4 years ago, I was when I first started getting really interested in Jamstack as a concept. I think I did actually see Phil give a presentation at a conference that really intrigued me. But like Gift, I had used some of those premises without knowing exactly what they were. But I think my initial inkling was when I was working at a big company where in order to use some of those services, it was a really big kit of parts, right? Like you had to glue a lot of different layers together and do a lot of kind of infrastructure pieces, set up CI/CD pipelines. And so the developer experience that I experienced when I was using Jamstack was just such a breeze and such a delight coming from that background. So that was kind of my entry drug. And then I quickly became a little bit more interested in the API economy surrounding it. So stuff like atomic deploys married with something like a Stripe API, like I couldn't really get my head around how powerful all this stuff was without, you know, a ton of configuration. Stuff that allowed me to preview sites before they were shipped, which was huge for the Vue docs. The Vue docs are actually built that way, and we do use it quite heavily to make sure that our work is stable and good before it, you know, hits prime time. And so it was like really critical for those projects. And we also had instant rollbacks when we had problems. So I think all of these put together is part of the reason why I started thinking like this is a really amazing way of developing.
So if I caught that right at the beginning, this is Phil's fault that you got into Jamstack a little bit.
I blame Phil for a lot of things. This is one of them.
All right, Phil, then what about you?
Well, how lovely to be shouldering the blame for something so early in the session. But yeah, so a few things really chime there with what both Sarah and Gift said. So I think I first came across this way of building sites back in about 2012, 2013, where I was really frustrated by building things with big content management systems and all of the overhead that brought with it, and all of the kind of cruft that brought into the front end code that I was trying to ship. I kind of identify as a front end developer. That's my kind of background, really. So so I was working at an agency and looking for simpler ways to do what felt actually like simple projects at the time. I didn't want to bring the usual stack that I was always carrying around for those projects. So I was starting to kind of, just hand turn HTML, frankly, for some projects that just didn't need the whole big stack behind it. But the thing I was missing was templating. That's something that's really nice when you're, using other stacks. You've got templating languages and server-side includes and all of those kind of things that we've been used to for a long time. So I got excited, like Gift, by Jekyll. I stumbled across Jekyll and found that I could have data over here or content over here and then templates there, crank the handle and then get a site out of it. And that really excited me. So I started using that for quite a lot of projects at the agency I was working at. And the arrival of GitHub Pages really brought that to the fore, I think, because then it brought that automation and then that Git-based workflow that would, kick off a build after you'd made your changes. And so that was kind of the start of my journey. And then from there, I discovered different static site generators. I've been guilty of that. I'll re-platform my own website again this year. I guess there's a new tool to experiment with. So I've been quite promiscuous with lots of different static site generators over the years, and kind of liked that portability that I've discovered as a result, because you can create these assets that you put somewhere and then enrich with different things. So that was kind of my journey to it. And like Sarah, things like the API economy flourishing has really compounded that as I started to kind of hook up kind of decoupled CMSs to front end builds and what have you. That really was the thing that got me very, very excited.
Yeah, and I was thinking, because we all kind of share, we got started with Jekyll, and I think that's a lot of people's experience getting started with Jekyll years ago. Funny story is, I've been messing around with this for long enough that when I started doing it, there was no Git-based workflow. When I started messing with this stuff, I used this little command line tool that would, because FTPing stuff was such a pain to keep track of. So like there was a tool that would just manage the FTP for me. So like when I was presenting it in San Francisco, and these two guys came up to me and said, "Oh, we built this thing. It makes it really easy to do this stuff. You should really check it out." And it became Netlify. And it was like, yeah, changed a lot of things for me, you know. So suddenly it was like I didn't have to mess with all this stuff, and it made it wholly different. You know, it's just on that note, you know, kind of even 4 or 5 years ago, you know, what we think of as the Jamstack now was primarily, I think a lot of people would call it like a niche tool. Really, people thought, oh, okay, it's for personal blogs, documentation. It sounds like even a lot of us got our start on personal blogs or documentation using these tools. So what do you think has changed over those years to make Jamstack a more mainstream web development solution that's like possible to build much more than blogs and documentation? Oh, sorry, I need to pick. My bad. This time we'll start with Sarah.
Yeah, I think seeing major successes out there for large enterprises have really adjusted this, that those kind of good developer tooling pieces that seemed like kind of a nice to have at first gave way to us understanding that developers really needed to have a way of not spending a huge amount of time setting up large and complex CI/CD systems that could have bugs of their own, and that could really provide things like secure sites, especially secure sites and things that stayed up during traffic spikes. So all of these things that seemed like, oh, that's nice, eventually gave way to, wait, how much developer productivity time are we getting back here? Because that translates into real money, right? So when you start to see bigger businesses going, oh, I can actually save a lot of money. My traffic isn't, you know, the amount of traffic isn't going to impact some sort of huge outage. That it could be a little bit more secure while we're doing so. That's when, you know, more and more of these pieces like Citrix moving gigantic pieces of their material over, like Peloton, like a bunch of these other services where you start to see people using it in a really intense and app kind of way. Even Netlify itself is built on Netlify, and all of that app that you use is built that way. I mean, I think that's when we started to see that those developer productivity and experience bits actually gave way for teams to be much more productive and to feel secure that their site isn't going to go down, or if it did, that they can have an instant rollback and have it right back up.
Awesome. Phil, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with that more. I think it felt like there's been both a push and a pull in the growth of this. I think as developers have got their hands on these tools, they felt very productive. And I certainly felt like a lot of things got out of my way, as kind of Sarah mentions there. And so there's been a bit of a push from developers to try and take that to their workplace and say, but what about this? I can be so much more productive. But then I think also there's been a pull from clients and customers who get to benefit and profit from these sites when they see them being well executed. I think developers being able to have stuff out of their way so they can really execute and then deliver a high performing site has been a real boon to some large brands who've benefited from that. And then that leads in a bit of an example. But I think critically, a big piece is the tools and services that have grown up around it. I mean, Brian, you mentioned kind of bumping into the founders of Netlify and seeing the tooling that they created, and that was an experience for me as well. But I think there's this whole suite of tools around the ecosystem that have brought all of these capabilities to what was, you know, what we used to describe as static sites. And it just kind of blows the doors off that definition now, because you've got things that you can have automate all of your builds. You can have content being drawn from these different services. You've got e-commerce capabilities that you can draw. So I think all of those things have really legitimized the whole approach and made the things that you can create with it just far more real world, if you like, than maybe we would have first thought when people started experimenting with it. So I think the whole environment has just matured as a result.
Right. You know, Gift, you said you started just trying to build your personal blog, but then now it sounds like you've built a lot of even much more complex things. I mean, what has changed it for you?
Yeah, I have to also agree with what Phil said regarding the ecosystem and the massive growth it has seen. I obviously started with personal websites and side projects, but currently I would say I use the Jamstack at work. Right now, I am part of a team building a fully fledged conference platform And we are doing that using Nox, Sanity for CMS and serverless functions. And just thinking about it, you would not call that a static site, right? Because obviously it has more hybrid approach to how we are building things at work, right? So I don't see it as just being a stack for personal websites or documentation. I think you can actually do more advanced things with the Jamstack. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've mentioned that I'm writing this book with Ray right now, and I remember when I wrote the first one, which I think was written like 4.5 years ago and came out like maybe 4 years ago, and even the advice I gave there doesn't. It's just amazing how quickly it doesn't apply anymore. It was like, oh, if you're building very dynamic experiences, like you probably don't want to use these tools, and it's, well, yeah, I would. The new book gets to throws all that advice out the window and said, they even said to me, like, put something in there where what you would advise you don't build with the Jamstack. And I'm like, that's really tough. I don't know. There's not that many things I could think of that you really couldn't build nowadays with the Jamstack. So we are taking questions from the audience too, and I'm encourage everybody to we have some really great people here, so ask your questions, but we do have one from Jaden. So what was the first static site generator or other Jamstack tool where you went, wow, this fixes all of my problems, and why? So we'll start with Phil this time.
Oh, fixes all of my problems. That's a hefty question. Well, let's see. I mean, I think I'm trying not to just let myself be wooed by the most recent thing that I've kind of fallen for, because everyone seems to have heard me going on about 11t before. But that is a static site generator that I particularly love, but it's not doing anything particularly new. It's just doing it in a way that I think is particularly elegant. So I'm not going to lean on that one. I think maybe one of the big aha moments for me was when I started using a decoupled CMS, because one of the problems or one of the limitations I found with static site generators as that was my route into Jamstack, was this decoupling of templates from content. And typically that would be done by having markdown files. And that's great for a developer. And that suited me down to the ground. I understood markdown and I understood the templates. So I was very, very happy. And you'd push them through this Git-based workflow and you'd get a site out at the end of it. But the boundary that made me reach was, well, what about content authors? They're not going to want to learn Git and they're not going to want to use Markdown. So for me, a real enabler was when the content management market started really understanding and embracing kind of a decoupled architecture. And I think the first one, the first one that I encountered or really got to grips with was Contentful, which of course is very, very popular and very successful now. But I think the moment that I started using a whole other platform that I didn't have to host or maintain or any of those things, but I could use as a service and then pull that content in. I remember the first project I worked on, it was pulling content into both a web experience and into a native application. This is when I was working at Agency Land. And I think it was that moment when I started using Contentful and critically was able to have content authors working in a suitable environment that then could bleed through to wherever I needed it. That was a big watershed moment for me, I think. Yeah.
I knew you were going to mention 11, so I thought it would be all about 11. That's okay. It turns out we have a lot of 11 fans here. I don't know. You didn't get to see Stephanie's presentation.
Oh, yeah. I'll be watching that. I'm desperate to see Stephanie's content. Brilliant.
Yeah. So Gift, it sounds like for you it might be Nuxt or something else, but you tell me.
Yeah. Okay. For me, I would say I try to gravitate towards the tool that works for my needs. So what am I trying to do, and can the tool actually fit that need? So right now I am on the Nuxt wave. I pretty much use it a lot. I use it every day. So Nuxt is great. I love Vue so much. So I I've been using Nox as well as Gridsom for a while now. I remember trying 11T, I think a year ago, but yeah, that was just an experiment. But seeing so many people, so many people writing on that, I might likely check it out again. But yeah, I love Nox and I use it a lot right now. I'm also very happy about the entire ecosystem, and because I work a lot with content, I have tried other tools as well. For example, Sanity and Storyblock are two tools that I definitely enjoy working with. I use Storyblock or I enjoy using Storyblock because I have that visual feel of the contents that I am trying to manage or change, and as well as plugging Sanity. So I use Sanity and Storyblock for a specific application. Storyblock is more like the visual aspect of the application, and use Sanity more like as a database for managing content for the application. So the Jamstack really gives you this flexibility to use as much tools, and I'm very excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And Sarah, what about for you?
Mine is very similar to Gifts. Maybe this is why we are good friends. We have very similar taste in this. I also really adore Nuxt. We did work with Next.js quite a bit for the Explorers platform. So we just built out a learning platform for my team called Jamstack Explorers, where you can get free courses and stuff. It's built with Next.js and Sanity. I like Next. I will say that I feel like Nuxt takes things to the next level for the creation of these things, the ability to create dynamic pages with the way that they use routing with such ease, and their plugin system, the way that you manage middleware, like they've thought of everything. And so every time I work with a new piece of it, I go, man, this is just like exactly the things I need without a lot of the things that I don't. And it's very thoughtful. So I'm a big Nuxt fan. I do like Sanity quite a bit because as kind of decoupled CMSs go, I like WYSIWYGs, but I kind of get a little annoyed when I can't configure everything myself. So what Sanity allows you to do is define a lot of things in schemas, and that's felt a little bit more comfortable to me in a way that I can just write what I need and describe it in the code and validate it in the code, and then it's there inside of a CMS in the traditional way. So that felt really good to me, and I really liked that a lot.
Awesome. So, I just to kind of give my perspective, I felt like, and it's not because Netlify is a sponsor. Honestly, it was Netlify that completely changed things for me. As I mentioned earlier, it was just like, this would pain. The tools were kind of a pain, but they were good for me, right? But the Netlify really changed what I could do with it, but just because it took the whole pain of deployment and build and everything out of the picture. Obviously now we have lots of options there, but I still love Netlify. So yeah, all right, we got more audience questions. I had a ton of questions for you all that I'm like eager to get answered to, but I definitely want to get to what the people here are interested in. So Esther has a question of, what is the best Jamstack tool to use for beginner in Vue? It sounds like both of you are, love Nuxt. I know Gift, you've messed with both Nuxt and Gridsom quite a bit, so maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. I would recommend starting with either Nox or Gridsom, because they both have different needs. So if you are starting off as a beginner, Gridsom might not be what you might not have that previous experience of GraphQL to understand how Gridsom and GraphQL works together. So then you might then want to focus on using Nox, right? But they both are amazing platforms, static site generators to use. So I would recommend either one of them if you're looking at starting.
Great. Yeah. And Sarah, I know you may have perspective on this, being that you are very active in the Vue community as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you're doing. I agree with Gift that, like, if you are familiar with GraphQL, then Gridsome is a good choice. It's kind of like, if you think about Gatsby, it's kind of similar to Gatsby in that it uses a lot of GraphQL to describe things. I personally think Nuxt is a great solution. I think it's very easy on beginners. Vue is pretty easy on beginners to begin with. Nuxt makes the abstractions a lot easier too. If you want to dive behind the abstractions just a little bit, not a lot, Vue CLI also works. Like Vue CLI, if you're just standing up a one-page thing, you don't actually need a meta framework. Vue CLI does quite well. It's when you start adding routing that like Nuxt really just takes care of that for you, where you'd have to add Vue Router if you were working with a Vue CLI application. And I think one other thing to mention is if it's a documentation site, VuePress is quite lovely. It's a lot of work has been done. I know Gift has a bunch of resources on how to work with VuePress, and Ben, who introduced us, also is a core team member for that team beyond just being a core team member for Vue. It's a really nice tool, and there's actually like VitePress coming out now, which Vite is a builder, is kind of like a tool that Evan has been working on for the past 8 months to a year, and so now it's basically like VuePress but with Vite at the core, and is quite fast, so it's cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. There really is a rich ecosystem of tools in Jamstack that are built for Vue developers. I mean, there's a lot of options. So actually, Phil, I'm going to ask you a different question from another one from one of our listeners here. Do you have any advice for someone interested in using a static site generator but doesn't have any JavaScript knowledge?
Doesn't have any JavaScript knowledge. Yeah, so it might be a surprise in some ways that I suggest a JavaScript-based static site generator as a result of that. But actually, I am going to invoke the 11ty word again, because and the reason I say that, although it's built from JavaScript, it's part of the JavaScript ecosystem, but it doesn't ship any JavaScript and it doesn't require you to write with any JavaScript. And that's actually one of the things I really like about that tool, and the kind of tools that I look for in general, actually, to something that does the least possible, the least power. The kind of the rule of least power is kind of what I'm thinking of there. And so if it's someone who's looking to start turning contents and template into web pages and generate HTML, I actually think 11ty is a really good place to start, because you can write just HTML and a tiny bit of logic and not really have to dabble with JavaScript at all, and you're generating HTML. And I think that's a really nice place to start. Now, of course, the other frameworks that we're talking about can also go a lot further and you get a lot more kind of out of the box for free, if you like. But I think they bring with them a requirement of a slightly deeper understanding of JavaScript and JavaScript principles. I think it's fair to say. So yeah, I think that's one of the places I would start. I suppose it does mean that you have to be happy with installing Node and using NPM and those kind of things. But I think the on-ramp into that is pretty reasonable. And I think that's probably one of the nicest web development environments to bootstrap from nothing. A couple of us have now mentioned Jekyll as a lovely on-ramp, which again has a similar approach in terms of you don't need to know JavaScript. It doesn't output JavaScript for you. 11ty is similar to that in many ways. But the thing that I think is different is that having the Ruby web development environment locally is a little bit more difficult to manage, I found. So that's why, in answer to the question, what would I go for if I didn't have JavaScript experience? That's my justification for answering with a JavaScript tool. I think the on-ramp into it is pretty approachable.
Yeah. I agree with your perspective there, Phil, in the sense that I'm not an 11ty user at the moment. I've toyed with it, but I always try and emphasize to people that, like, particularly when you're thinking about like these more traditional static site generators, which 11ty kind of falls into, right? The language it's built in generally isn't that important. I mean, I don't know a lick of Ruby, and I used Jekyll for years. I don't know Go, and I use Hugo all the time, right? Like, so you don't have to get that deep into whatever the underlying language it's built with just to be able to use those tools.
And I suspect as well, you could probably find a static site generator that's been written in any language.
Yes.
I know that when I started exploring this and started giving talks on it, I would have a slide that had like a list of static site generators. And by the time I'd finished my talk, that slide was out of date. I'd have to update the number all the time because I think often it feels like a very tangible problem to try and solve yourself. So a lot of people have built static site generators and some have become more popular than others, but I think it's fair to say that you can probably find one in a language that you're familiar with, but often that doesn't have an impact on what you'll be doing day to day using it.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, I think the last time I checked, it was like 408 on that staticsitegenerators.net site that lists them all, something like that. So it's crazy. Okay, so I'm going to actually, so that we can get to as many questions as we can, I'm not going to ask everybody the same question. So I'm going to go to Sarah with, what are the current limits on where Jamstack applies? Can you give an example of a kind of site that is not at the moment a good fit or would be challenging to build in the Jamstack?
It's a good question. You kind of touched on this earlier, where like a few years ago, I think I would have had a better answer for this, but the boundaries are getting bigger and bigger. So I guess like the answer is it kind of depends. There's not a lot of things that I would say you can't do on Jamstack. There are some things that I would say like are maybe more complicated to do on Jamstack. So like, a while ago, I would have said like, well, if you have something that's like, keeping persistent state all of the time, like WebSockets, that's a poor implementation because you're typically adding a serverless function to, create that, and that's a function invocation, and then you have something persist. Now there's like lots of APIs that allow you to do just those things. So like I think that even some of the platforms I mentioned before are doing that. So it's not really a limitation anymore. One of the things I think is maybe slightly more clunky is if you have a site with millions and millions of pages and you need to pre-build those millions and millions of pages, you can still do it by kind of sharding each area of them and proxying them together, and then you have slightly slower build times or faster build times because you're not doing it all at once. That implementation is a little bit harder to do than some other ones for millions of pages, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible at all. And we definitely, even at Netlify, have lots of clients who do that. But that one is kind of like, does that suit you?
Yeah, that sounds complicated. But I'd love your thoughts on this question, actually.
Yeah, I kind of have the same sentiments with Sarah. A few years ago, you would say, okay, there's some certain applications or sites that you can build with the Jamstack, but now the possibilities are endless, I would say. I think something I would like to mention that could be a limitation is costs of running all of these APIs, all of these services put together. So if you're, for instance, have a personal project and you have to use most of this application or most of these APIs gives you free, you can use them for free until a certain limit, and then you have to start paying for them. So if you're building a side project that you then need to pay for this service, pay for that service, and bringing all those costs together as an indie hacker, maybe that might be a limitation. Cost of running all of this service might be a limitation, but really I still don't see that as a problem, because if you're thinking of building an application, you should obviously be able to afford to build it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't even think about, the cost does factor in. I find Jamstack is generally, as a rule, like much cheaper than the alternative. I remember the days when I had to pay for servers and SQL Server and all that other stuff. Oh my God, my little personal projects would cost me in the hundreds of dollars a month. One thing I was thinking of, and maybe Phil, you have an opinion on that, is, the one example I always give is if you have a lot of user-generated content, I mean, does that become very difficult to manage?
It's that depends answer again, I think. But yes, that is an area that kind of similar to what Sarah was saying a while ago. That would have been a bit of a puzzler. But it kind of depends on the type of content you're talking about. When you mentioned user-generated content, that's often the kind of content that maybe you don't want to, or you don't need to pre-generate for the purposes of being crawlable by web browser, by search engines and what have you. So there might be slightly different kind of use cases for that. You absolutely can be serving lots of unique pages with unique content on them that are personalized to individuals because of the nature of decoupling the front end from the content. So for instance, just to cite an example that's very close to home for me, app.netlify.com, which is the admin interface for Netlify, that serves very personalized content to millions of people. And it does so through serving a static front end, like a React application. And then it has a decoupled API that pulls in the content that is personalized and very timely, and it changes very, very frequently. So there's lots of different models for how you deliver a Jamstack site. And I think there's a tendency to think, well, it means that we have to pre-generate every view of every bit of content. But of course, you can enrich things in the client, which is a core kind of principle of Jamstack. I'm a big fan of generating as much as you possibly can ahead of time, but when you need to enrich, you can enrich, and that's how these abstracted kind of decoupled APIs help you deliver that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up a good point, which is really, in many respects, what you're used to in terms of a single page application still applies to a Jamstack application. In fact, many of them are single page applications, just with pre-generated portions, right? So yeah, that's really.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
Go ahead.
I made a silly kind of little proof of concept to kind of demonstrate part of this, which is like a site where you've got a set of templates and some data that lives in a database, and a user can add some content to it. And it's called vlolly because it's a virtual lolly, because everyone needs to send a lollipop to somebody. But it's just a silly example of saying, okay, form data that you then want to create a page, and that would push data into a database and then kick off another build to refresh the build. But meanwhile, while that's happening, you want to have instant access to a view of that data on a page, and you can serve that from a serverless function. So there's, again, it kind of falls back to this thing of the tooling has just evolved so much now. So now, it's quite commonplace to be able to say, well, if I have a 404 on a URL, what do I do with that? And I can route that to a serverless function that can get the data directly from the database and render a view. And it will stop being a 404 when the build's completed for that new URL. So there's quite a few ways that you can stitch things together. And it sounds like a complex set of pieces there, but it was actually not a very complex thing to put together that just builds on those principles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember your lollipop demo app. The only thing that makes me sad is nobody ever sent me a lollipop.
Oh, Brian, I feel terrible.
So we have a question from Linus. It says, by the time you learn something like 11e, another cool static site generator is coming out, what are your views on this trend and the future? Like, I suppose, do we feel like we're settling down on a group of solutions, or are we still going to see this trend of kind of constantly new ones coming out on a regular basis? Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the kind of recent history of computer programming, it's always that there's more abstractions, right? Like we have, when you look at infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, functions as a service, like things just get more and more abstracted. And what I think Jamstack does is people even say like, well, we had these tools. It's like, yes, we did have these tools, but that configuration of abstraction is the defining moment, right? It is saying like, okay, we had these, but you no longer have to stitch together 20 things in order for that to happen, for you to have it right at your fingertips. I think as we see this go further, we will see different pieces of those technologies either give birth to wider use cases or be able to integrate with more different pieces of other things so that they can become more and more dynamic. But at the same time, we'll also see that those abstraction layers will become more refined. So even though things might get more complex in terms of glue layers, agnosticism, things like that, and use cases, the developer experience will become more refined and it will be easier to do so. It will become easier to integrate, and those things will be more and more at your fingertips, which is why I, care about developer experience so much. I think that that is a key piece to unlocking some of these things. It's not just a nice to have. It's not just a, oh man, I wish I could do this faster. It actually allows you to have deeper and wider use cases, which end up at the human computer action layer, which is where I'm excited to see them.
Yeah, that's amazing. I agree with you completely. Gift, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I'll agree with what Sarah said, and also add that generally with the ecosystem, things are always going to be improving, right? So regardless of the tools that we have right now, there's always going to be new and improvement on the ones that we currently have. So definitely there will be more, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes.
Yeah. I think, I agree with both of you. I think, first of all, I would say it hasn't been that crazy lately. I haven't seen that many. It seems like we've kind of settled, right? I mean, not too much. There's still new static site generators coming out, but I mean, I just wrote a post, for instance, for Snipcart that talked about it, and they had their last year post and their this year post, and I ended up with the same list of static site generators that would be the ones I'd recommend. It's just slightly different order, but that was the same list. I mean, does it feel to you, Phil, like we're settling down a little bit, or do you really think the pace is going to pick up? Or
I don't know if I'd say settling down. I'd definitely say maturing. I mean, I think it's a very lively ecosystem, and I think lots of people are getting involved and lots of new tools are arriving. But I certainly think that we're seeing greater levels of maturity in all of the tools that are starting to really get a lot of momentum. And I think also organizations and communities are really coalescing around some of these tools, and therefore I think they've got much greater longevity than maybe we would have thought before, as some of these things might have been more personal or smaller projects. Now there are huge businesses built on top of it, and I think that brings momentum. I would kind of speak to one aspect of the question that I think I detected. I don't know if this is part of the question or not, but I think there's a tendency to think there's a new tool coming out. Do I have to adopt it? And I'm my own worst enemy for my own personal projects for that. I try not to let that mistake happen in my professional life. But I would say that just because there is a new tool that is a new front end, a framework or a library or a different part of the platform, doesn't mean you have to adopt it. If the tools that you're using work for you and they're a good solution, you don't have to throw them away and adopt the next thing. And the one thing I really like about Jamstack is that if there's one part of the whole tool chain that doesn't fit your needs anymore and a new tool comes along for that, they're nicely decoupled. So there are opportunities to switch out some parts of your suite of tools for others. So it's not an all or nothing migration. So, but also critically, you don't need to change if everything's working for you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Sorry, Sarah, you had a thought on that?
Well, just to piggyback on what Phil's saying too, if we're talking about the ecosystem, the static site generator piece is really just one piece of that too, right? Like there's everyone, like every hosting provider in the world now has a Jamstack solution, which was not the case a couple of years ago. And I think a lot of that had to do with 2020 being a kind of ridiculously crazy year where all of these small businesses and shops that never saw themselves as coming online eventually all had to come online at the same time. So we saw a bit of a renaissance of this, like, okay, how do I get this thing online as soon as possible? And so some of those static site generators might have stayed consistent or grew in terms of versioning, but what we saw was so many people coming to them needing the same kind of e-commerce experience, the same kind of web presence, and the ability to kind of continuously deploy through all of that. So that was maybe something that was shaped less by the Jamstack community and more by the community, the world community.
Yeah, and you make an excellent point that we tend to focus a lot of times on the static site generator, but I mean this is not just about static site generators. I mean there's all these tools and services and everything and that's kind of what even the whole point of this was to bring all, talk about all those pieces, because the static site generator is just one decision point on a large set of decisions you have to make when you're building a Jamstack application. So, well, first of all, this was amazing. We are actually running out of time, and I'm really sad about that because I had so many other great questions, and it's not like I get a group like this together all the time. So, it's like, if only next year we'll do it again. So I want to thank you, Gift, thank you, Sarah, thank you, Phil, for joining us. This was fantastic. And I think I learned a lot, and I hope that everybody in the audience did as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time.